So as screen says, we're talking about Bylaw 17 today, and particularly taking a closer look at out-of-season activities. So here's our agenda. I'm going to kick us off with some physical activities outside the season, diving a little deeper into the areas specifically of strength and conditioning activities and captain's practices. We're going to go over some examples in strength and conditioning activities and captain's practices. We're just going to really pull apart the definition, some changes in the legislation that have occurred, and kind of just make sure everybody's on the same page regarding those. After we dive into some physical stuff, we'll go over to the non-physical activities outside the season, and Caitlin will walk you through leadership programming and team building activities and social media connections. All right, so let's talk about athletically related activities. So as you know, you can only conduct athletically related activities during the declared playing season. So anything that's considered athletically related activity cannot be conducted by an institution outside of the declared playing season. While you usually probably focus on the definition of practice in Bylaw 170211, I wanted to make a point of pulling out some of the areas of that bylaw that also deals directly with strength and conditioning activities, since we'll be talking about those today. So, for instance, 170211F says individual workouts required or supervised by a member of the coaching staff are athletically related activities, and involvement of an institution's strength and conditioning staff with enrolled student athletes in required conditioning programs are also considered athletically related activities. So we'll keep these definitions in mind as we move through this section. For strength and conditioning workouts to be accepted from athletically related activities, they must be voluntary, they must be conducted by a strength and conditioning coach who is certified by a nationally recognized program, and they must be conducted during the regular academic year. If the certified strength and conditioning coach is also a sport coach or a staff member on a team, so think a coach, that coach must also conduct voluntary workouts for all student athletes. For monitored workouts to be accepted from athletically related activities, they must be voluntary. They may only be monitored for safety by a strength and conditioning coach, and that strength and conditioning coach can either be certified or non-certified. Additionally, if a certified strength and conditioning coach is also a sport coach or a staff member of the team, that coach may only monitor if they are performing monitoring duties for all student athletes using the facility at the same time. Actually, that coach could be certified or uncertified for monitoring purposes, excuse me. So there are a few legislative exceptions that relate specifically to the use or the reservation of strength and conditioning facilities. And they can be found in this long bylaw, 1702111141, right? And they say student athletes may use student athlete only facilities for voluntary workouts at any time. Certified strength and conditioning coaches may conduct voluntary workouts in student athlete only facilities. And certified strength and conditioning coaches may reserve institutional workouts for institutional facilities for voluntary workouts that they will conduct themselves. So we're going to keep these exceptions in mind for our later discussion on captain's practice, but keep this just in your head when we're talking about athletically related activities. This section regarding strength and conditioning facilities also plays a role in what's accepted from athletically related activity. So a question we receive pretty often when we're talking in this space is what qualifies as a nationally recognized program for the certification purposes for voluntary workouts and strength and conditioning certification. The legislation does not include a list of acceptable strength and conditioning certifications or certifying agencies. Instead, an August 1st, 2011 educational column provides education and suggested best practices that institutions should consider when evaluating a certification or a certifying agency. Specifically, institutions should consider whether the certifying strength and conditioning agency is accredited by an oversight organization, for example, the NCCA accreditation. 2, whether it requires an undergraduate college degree. 3, whether it requires a continuing education component. And 4, whether it requires current first aid, CPR, and AED use certification. So these are just some general things that an institution should be looking at when it's determining whether or not a certification that its coach wants to receive is good enough or sufficient enough to protect its student athletes and meet the requirements of our legislation. So one of the other things that is necessary for strength and conditioning activities with a certified coach to be accepted from athletically related activity is that they must be voluntary. So what do we mean when we say voluntary? Bylaw 1702-14 provides all the details. Specifically, student athletes must not be required to report back to any of his or her sport-specific coaches any information related to the activity. In addition, no athletics department staff member who observes, monitors, or conducts the activity, so think strength coach, a trainer, or a manager, may report back to the student athlete's coach any information related to the activity. Second, the activity must be initiated solely by the student athlete. Neither the institution nor any athletics department staff member may require the student athlete to participate in the activity at any time. Third, the student athlete's attendance and participation in the activity, or lack thereof, may not be recorded for the purposes of reporting such information to coaching staff members or other student athletes. And finally, the student athlete may not be subjected to penalties if they elect to participate, if they elect not to participate in the activity. In addition, neither the institution nor any athletics department staff member may provide recognition or incentives, so think awards, to a student athlete based on his or her attendance or performance in the activity.
Can the strength and conditioning coach conduct virtual workouts over the summer if workouts are made available to the entire campus community?
So I think we're going to hold, if we can, we're going to hold that question for a moment because I'm going to talk a little bit about summer workouts on a later slide. I think generally what I will say in response to that is virtual workouts in the virtual workout space is something that we've talked more about in the COVID space, and institutions should take into account things like liability, their legal guidance, anything when they're thinking of conducting virtual workouts, whether during season or at some other time. Generally, during the summer, a strength and conditioning coach is not permitted to provide workouts to student athletes, but if that service is available to all students and anyone can sign at any time, I think that would be a permissible space. Again, I think an institution should really be careful. That would be, just taking into account the potential liabilities and things like that would exist with a virtual workout.
Awesome, thank you. And then if a coach who is not currently strength and conditioning certified becomes certified, does that mean they can start to work with their own student athletes in the off season?
And I'm assuming that's off season during the academic year still. And yes, they would be able to, however, they must also work with any other student athletes and all other student athletes. A coach who becomes certified, a team coach who becomes certified as strength and conditioning coach can't use their strength and conditioning kind of certification as a way to circumvent out of season activities. So that coach would also need to be working with student athletes from other teams in order to do workouts with their own team.
Awesome.
Thank you. All right, so now we're going to look at a couple of examples, and I'm sure some of these examples are going to cover things we just talked about, so just bear with me, and hopefully this won't be too painful. So RSRO number 1, these are questions that we actually get into our system. We do not make these questions up for purposes of regional rules, so I just wanted to put that out there. But this first question is, during the non-traditional segment for the fall and spring student athletes, can lifting sessions be excluded from the 16 days of athletically related activity? And so the answer we gave to this question is they have to count unless they meet 1702.114, which is voluntary workouts conducted by a strength and conditioning coach. So the non-traditional session, you're limited to your 16 countable days, and if a lifting session is required, going back to our previous, when we looked at our first couple slides, our definitions of what practice is or athletically related activity is, included strength and conditioning activities that are required by a coach or supervised by a coach. So consistent with that, if these are lifting sessions that are being conducted by a staff member or required for participation they would count towards the 16 days. The only strength and conditioning workouts that would be excluded are those voluntary workouts that aren't reported back, that aren't being tracked, and are conducted by a certified strength and conditioning coach on your campus. All right, question number 2, and this kind of delves into a previous question we were talking about. Our strength and conditioning coach wants to offer a 6 a.m. lift for those who do internships. However, our regular gym will not be open until 8 or 9 a.m. Is it permissible for our summer weight room hours for our varsity-only weight room to be open earlier than the regular facility for non-athletes? So for this answer, it's permissible for the varsity weight room to have earlier summer hours and for the strength and conditioning coach to monitor for safety. However, it's impermissible for the strength and conditioning coach to conduct workouts over the summer. So if we remember back to the definition of voluntary strength and conditioning activities conducted by a certified strength and conditioning coach, it's specified that these can only happen during the regular academic year. And we have a March 26, 2009 official interpretation that provides the parameters for what a strength and conditioning coach could do at a time when they are not able to conduct workouts themselves. It provides the definition of the term monitoring and the parameters for that. So monitoring can include observing and watching closely student athletes to ensure safety. It may also include demonstration of the proper technique of a lift. However, the strength and conditioning coach may not instruct a student athlete to complete a specified number of repetitions or sets to ensure the student athlete maximizes his or her workout. So it would be permissible for the strength and conditioning coach to monitor their facility over the summer to keep student athletes in a safe environment. However, that strength and conditioning coach would not be permitted to conduct actual workouts in the summer. Our final question that we're going to look at is, the competition gymnasium is accessible to basketball and volleyball student athletes 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week with their ID, which can be swiped to let them into their locker rooms and then into the gym. If this facility is not available for all students with the same accessibility 24/7 or even ever, can the student athletes use the facility anytime they would like? And for this answer, it's permissible during the academic year. So student athletes are able to access student athlete only facilities anytime during the academic year. As we talked about in 1702.111141 regarding strength and conditioning facilities that are student athlete specific, if the student athletes were trying to access that, they are able to do that at any time, including the summer. So there's a January 14th, 2016 ed column that dives more into that about accessibility in summer, during summertime for strength and conditioning facilities that are specific to student athletes, and it provides clarification that that would include the summer. There's also an April 19th, 2019 educational column that indicates that a student athlete may use a sports-specific facility outside the season, even if those facilities are not available to the general student population. So in this case, during the academic year, a student athlete only facility that's not related to strength and conditioning would be able to be accessed during the regular academic year. And if that facility was specifically for strength and conditioning activities, the student athletes could also access that during the summer. I'm going to transition over to captain's practices. So in February, there was a Twitter poll question sent out by the Division III Twitter that asked followers the question, true or false, as to whether captain's practice are permissible outside the declared playing season. And unfortunately, my X is already over it, but as you can see, a vast majority of people thought this was true, that captain's practices are permissible outside the declared playing season, which then said to us as staff, oh no, we must have confused them in some way, which is why we were talking about this again. Captain's practices are not permissible outside the declared playing and practice season. So we're going to dive in on the next couple slides into the definition of captain's practice, and I'm going to provide you more detail about why they're not permissible outside of your 18, 19, or 24-week season. So as you can see on the screen, prior to the non-controversial legislation 2020-1 that Corey and Bill will talk more about during their session on new legislation, captain's practice was defined by 4 bullets, including the one that's currently crossed out. So it was on-court or on-field activities that were limited to members or called by members of a team, that were limited primarily to members of that team, and that were considered to be required for participation in that sport. If a given activity fit each of these bullets, it was considered to be athletically related activity. And per our legislation, Division III legislation, athletically related activities can only take place during the declared playing and practice season. As a result, any captain's practice is an athletically related activity and can only permissibly take place during the season, not outside the season. So I mentioned this non-controversial legislation, and did this non-controversial legislation somehow make captain's practices permissible at any time inside or outside of the declared season? The answer to that is no. So captain's practices are still considered athletically related activities for purposes of Bylaw 170211, and they are still impermissible outside the declared playing season. Instead, what the non-controversial legislation did was change the definition of captain's practices for purposes of the legislation. So specifically, it removed that third bullet, the one that limited an activity to primarily members of one team. Now, a captain's practice is defined by the other three bullets that are on the page: on-court or on-field activities that were called by members of a team and that are considered required for participation in that sport. This new definition does not change the fact that captain's practices are athletically related activities, and it does not change the fact that they are not permissible outside of the season. But what we learned is from feedback and other things taken from the membership is that there still needs to be some explanation of the difference between what's impermissible outside the season, a captain's practice, and what can be permissible outside the season, which is a voluntary out-of-season activity that's limited primarily to members of the same team. So the Interpretations and Legislation Committee approved an April 19, 2019 educational column to assist the membership with this specifically. The educational column clarified several areas regarding what constitutes required. It also focused on the reservation of facilities. So a primary difference with the change is that student athletes can reserve a facility for use exclusively by teammates. Assuming it's a general use facility, then that opportunity has to be available to any student to so reserve. So any student on your campus has to be able to reserve a facility. Before, if a student athlete reserved a facility, it could only be reserved for the specific activity, so let's say basketball, shoot around, but could not be limited to participants of just the team, as that would constitute a captain's practice. Since the definition no longer includes confined primarily to members of the team, this restriction is no longer applicable. If the facility is a sport-specific facility, such access by student athletes outside the season would be permissible at the discretion of the institution. This issue is also a change, but reflects concerns expressed by the membership regarding safety and liability with these types of facilities. As you can see from this slide, there are still some limitations in place. Specifically, a coach may not reserve the facilities for student athletes, and a coach may not direct the student athletes to reserve those facilities. Additionally, coaches may not observe the activity even if their job function is to monitor facilities, if the facility is reserved at that time specifically for student athletes. This is consistent with another exception we have in our bylaws for athletically related activity, Bylaw 17021113, related to observation of facilities, as that reserved facility is no longer open to the general student body. So once it's been reserved just for members of that team, it's no longer an open facility, and as such, even a coach with monitoring duties would not be able to be in the facility. Finally, coaches are not permitted to provide practice plans for these activities. A coach could permissibly provide certain drills, provided the drills are just being explained, and it's not the dictation of when and how many and at what frequency or pace those drills need to be performed. So captain's practices, still impermissible. Voluntary out-of-season activities limited primarily to members of the team can be permissible under this guidance. Yeah.
A couple of different versions of the same question here, so I'm going to paraphrase. Does an open gym where the team plays pickup count as a captain's practice?
All right, I'm gonna go back a slide. Oh, actually, I gave my control to Caitlin already, but it would depend on whether or not people were required to be there for participation. Just the limitation of teammates in an open gym playing pickup is not in and of itself, thank you, Caitlin, is not in and of itself a captain's practice. So if we go back to this definition, right, a pickup game in an open gym that anybody can come to is good to go so long as it's not required for participation in that sport. An open gym that the whole team's at one end is okay so long as it's not required participation for that sport.
This one's about reserving facilities. Can our associate athletic director for facilities reserve the space for student athletes outside of their season as they would for any other student organization during the year?
So yeah, if it's in the job description of that person, like if student athletes or students generally don't have the ability to reserve facilities on their own and there's a person that they have to go to reserve those facilities, that's okay. It just has to be at the students or the student athletes' request or direction. So that associate athletic director for facilities wouldn't be able to unilaterally say this time space is reserved for men's basketball, this time space is reserved for women's basketball, this time space is reserved for, you know, baseball or hockey or whatever. Students would still need to go, student athletes would still need to go and do the reserving on their own.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem.
And I've got one more for you before we toss it over to Caitlin. May a coach suggest activities to take place at a voluntary gathering of the team?
Yeah, I think that kind of, I think that's a little murky, and it goes to the, you might be able to provide a drill that gives, you know, the actual explanation, but once coaches are involved in this is what you should do at a voluntary activity, it's no longer a voluntary activity, right? Now we have coaches' involvement. And so I think my recommendation or what I would say is it would not be within the interest of, if you want to truly keep it voluntary, a coach shouldn't be making any type of recommendation on the things that a student athlete does. That's the best way to keep an activity voluntary. As soon as a coach has some type of involvement in what drill should be done or what activity should be done, or, hey, here's some things you may want to think about, I think it starts to look and feel less like a voluntary out-of-season activity. Now I'm going to, all right, and give control back over to Caitlin, and she's going to walk you through the non-physical stuff out of season.
Good afternoon, everyone. So you get the question on campus, and we often get it in the national office. What can your coaches do outside the season to help their student athletes further their development as athletes and individuals? So the first step in answering that question is identifying whether there's an athletics nexus involved in the activity. If there is an athletics connection or an athletics nexus to the activity, it runs the risk of being considered an athletically related activity that Tiffany defined earlier, or instruction involving sports, or a practice activity. So as we know in 170211, practice is defined as any meeting, activity, or instruction involving sports-related information and having an athletics purpose held for one or more student athletes at the direction of or supervised by any member or members of the institution's coaching staff. And as Tiffany discussed earlier, the legislation prohibits a coach from being involved outside the season with their student athletes in athletically related activities. So, however, effective August 1st, there is this new legislated exception to athletically related activities for leadership programming, which would allow your coaches to engage in leadership programming that involves sports-related information with their student-athlete leaders outside the season, provided the programming satisfies all the conditions listed in the legislation. So those conditions are in bullets on the slide, as you can see in front of you. The first condition is that the programming must not include the practice activities in Bylaw 170211. So you can look to that legislation for the full list of practice activities, but to name a few common ones, that would include floor or on-court activity, chalk talk, film review, competition, required weight training, camps, clinics, and individual workouts and practice called by members of the team. The second condition is that the programming must occur during the academic year and must be completed no later than 5 days before the start of the institution's official final exam period. So the academic year is defined by the institution in their academic calendar. So it might look different for different institutions. And while it may seem obvious, this exception to athletically related activities would preclude this type of leadership programming from occurring over summer break. The third condition is that the programming must be limited to one 90-minute meeting per week, not more than 10 times outside the season. This is a student-athlete specific restriction per sport, meaning that any given student-athlete cannot participate in more than one 90-minute meeting per week and no more than 10 sessions outside the season for their particular sport. So if you have a student-athlete that's a multi-sport student-athlete, for example, they participate in football and outdoor track and field, that student-athlete could have access to 10 sessions for football and 10 sessions for outdoor track and field outside their respective seasons, with the one 90-minute meeting per week restriction applying per sport. The last condition is that the programming plan must be submitted to the athletics director and compliance officer. So it's on the institution to determine the materials needed to properly document the leadership programming plan, but if there are any changes to the plan that's originally submitted, the documentation put on file should reflect that. There's some other things to keep in mind for this new legislation. It is not permissible to engage in physical activities, for example, a ropes course, as part of leadership programming. Next, who determines whether a student athlete is serving in a team leadership capacity? The coach does. So could technically all of the team's student athletes participate in this type of leadership programming at any given time? There is no limit to the number of student athletes from a team that may be involved in leadership programming, but the intent of the legislation is for these programming sessions to occur in small group settings, and it's up to the institution to define what constitutes a small group based on the student athletes involved and the type of programming. Additionally, the institution may not finance the leadership programming, this is really important, unless the similar programming is available to the institution's students. So this means the students participating in leadership programming this way would have to pay for the programming and any associated costs, including transportation to and from the programming. It does not have to occur on campus. And lastly, the other consideration is that this type of leadership programming may not occur during an official vacation period. This would include summer, between terms, and before initial enrollment.
If a coach wanted their team to read a book over the summer, is that permissible?
It looks like someone may be getting a little ahead of me. We've got, we'll address the team leadership programming. So this is specific to your team leaders. If you're looking to engage in leadership programming with your team and have them read a book, I'm going to address that in my next section as another way to stay involved with your team outside the season when it involves the entire team. So say your coach wants to engage with their student athletes over the summer and not just their leaders, they want to engage with their entire team. Where would that fit in the current legislation? So Bylaw 16.3.2 provides the parameters for such leadership programming activities. But unlike the new legislation, it only permits leadership programming to involve sports-related information outside the season if similar programming is available to students generally, and it's not limited to members of one team, and the participation is voluntary. So these conditions matter because otherwise the activity starts to look like practice, which we know is not permissible out of season. So it is not permissible for a team to participate in team bonding or team building activities either outside of the season. And although team bonding or team building activities are not explicitly mentioned in Bylaw 17.02.11 when we define practice, team bonding implies that the activity is athletically related and would trigger the definition of practice. So regardless of whether the student athletes are paying for themselves or their participation is voluntary, team bonding or team building activities must occur during the playing and practice season. So this final point that I'm trying to make here on this slide kind of hits at that question from earlier. So say, you want your team to read a book or you want to do a team Bible study, the coach with their entire team. I would say don't automatically assume that if the programming appears to be on its face non-athletically related, that don't assume that it's permissible. It may have an athletics nexus. So if you're going to do these types of activities, like assign them or to recommend they read a book or do a team Bible study, there needs to be a non-athletics reason for limiting the session to just the team. If the activity constitutes a regular meeting between the team and the coach, like a weekly Bible study or weekly check-ins regarding that book, there could be a perception that these activities are mandatory. And we know that a regular mandatory meeting with the coach and student athletes would not be allowed outside the season. So it really, I think the recommendation here is not activities that don't have an athletics purpose need to be examined a little bit extra to help explain why it would be limited to members of that team only. There needs to be a non-athletics reason, and it needs to not look like practice in terms of, the regular meetings. So I would encourage you to do that extra analysis.
Hey, Caitlin, we've got one that's back for the small group programming.
Okay.
Is it true that the student athletes can't be provided with any materials unless they pay for them, things like handouts or packets?
I'm trying to, I know that there are no benefits associated with the programming, so I'm not sure if I might have to recruit some help for that question in terms of providing materials for the leadership programming. I would believe that they would have to provide their own, but Jeff, do you have anything to add there?
I think you would look under the same standard you would look under any other potential benefits. When we're talking about leadership programming available to other students, are you providing those type of materials? And if you can point to an example on your campus, what your institution does for other leadership programming, and if they provide those type of materials or similar type of materials, that would certainly be fine.
When we talk about team bonding activities, are we only talking about activities set up by the coaching staff? What if the team wants to do something on their own where there's no coach involvement?
I think, again, you're looking at the definition of practice. If there's no coach involvement and it doesn't have an athletics purpose, I don't believe we would say that without the coach involvement and without direction by the coaching staff, I don't think we would consider that practice per the definition of 170211 if it's just the team doing something voluntarily by themselves. So remember, this half of the presentation is about how your coaches can stay involved with their student athletes outside the season. Another area where we get questions in this space other than leadership programming is through social media, how your coaches can stay engaged with their student athletes when their participation, stay engaged with their student athletes on social media when there's a reference to their engagement in voluntary athletically related activities. So for that analysis, we're going to revisit that definition that Tiffany discussed earlier about what makes an activity voluntary. And so in order for any athletically related activity to be considered voluntary, all of the following conditions must be met. First, no reporting back to the coaching staff, and that includes the student athlete not reporting back, and the strength coach, trainer, or manager who otherwise may be observing or monitoring or conducting the activity, they can't be reporting back either. So the activity must also be initiated solely by the student athlete. Neither the institution nor the athletics department staff member can require the student athlete to participate in the activity at any time. Third, you cannot record the student athlete's attendance and participation in the activity or the lack thereof. For the purposes of reporting such information to the coaching staff members or other student athletes, you wouldn't be able to record it. And then lastly, there can't be a penalty or an award based on the student athlete's participation in the activity. So you may be thinking, how am I supposed to monitor every single student athlete's social media account? In short, that's not the expectation, and nor is it realistic. When a student athlete posts about their voluntary athletically related activities, it becomes your concern if it has some element of institutional involvement, because that might negate the voluntary nature of the activity. So we can test that through the examples on the slides, again, keeping at the forefront of this analysis those conditions that make an activity voluntary. So the first example is a student athlete posting their voluntary workouts on their personal social media accounts. Is this permissible? The answer is yes. If the student athlete is just voluntarily posting them doing their voluntary workouts out of season, and it's not directed by the coaching staff, then the post is fine. The key here is the institutional involvement. It wouldn't be here, so it wouldn't be an issue. The second example is a student athlete posting photos or videos on their social media accounts or on of voluntary workouts on the team or athletics department account. Would that be permissible? So it would not be permissible for the student athlete to post their voluntary workouts on the team or athletics department account because this no longer makes it voluntary and it would be considered reporting back. The student athlete posting on the institutional account makes it an institutional action. So going back to the voluntary nature of the activity, it starts to look much less voluntary when an institutional account that's either run by the institution, run by the coach or the athletics department, et cetera, is posting a student athlete's out of season voluntary workout. So lastly on the social media one before we open up to questions, what about if a student athlete posts on their personal social media page but they tag the coach, the team account, or some other athletics department account? Again, this is the student athlete posting on their personal page and they happen to tag your institutional account. Is that okay? The short answer is yes, it's okay, because it's not being produced by the institution. You can't necessarily control it unless, if the coach is directing them to tag the institutional account, that's one thing and that would make it impermissible, but if the student athlete is engaged in the involuntary workout and they just happen to tag your institutional account, that's not being produced by the institution. It's not going to be considered impermissible. Where there is a higher expectation of monitoring is when it comes to actions taken by institutional athletics staff. So kind of back to that last example real quick, when you had the student athlete posting about on their personal social media page and tagging the institutional's account or the coach's account, what would make that impermissible potentially is the coach responding in some type of way. So if the coach liked that post because they were tagged in it, or they commented on it, or they reposted it to an institutional account, or even the coach's personal account, that in and of itself would make the post impermissible because it reflects monitoring. The coach is acknowledging the post and recognizing it, which just negates the voluntary nature of it. So like I said, there's a higher expectation when it comes to athletic staff's involvement in these types of activities, which is what we're going to address on this chart. And remember, this chart only pertains to their involvement with student athletes' social media posts about voluntary workouts outside the season, and what drives that analysis is what the conditions that make an activity voluntary. So the first question, or the first example, is a coach posts photos of a student athlete engaging in voluntary workouts on a personal or team account. So we're talking about the coach's personal page or the team page. Is that permissible? You'll see up on the screen that it's not. So the coach is recording the student athlete's participation in the activity, which again negates the voluntary nature of it. Also, we know that the coach's personal social media account cannot be divorced from his occupation as a coach. So this post would be impermissible if posted to an actual institutional account or the coach's personal social media account. So the next example is a coach liking or reposting photos of student athletes engaging in voluntary workouts. As we noted earlier, the coach cannot take an action of approval of the student athlete's content like liking or favoriting or reposting. This indicates some recognition of what is supposed to be a voluntary workout. So in these top two examples, we're seeing a coach not only tracking what the student athlete is doing workout-wise out of season, but there's this extra step of recognizing their work in their sport out of season. So posting about it, liking it, reposting it, makes these activities no longer voluntary because the coach is essentially, endorsing the student athletes participating in their out-of-season workouts. I think there's no expectation that, the coach's aren't following their PSAs or their student athletes' social media pages. But like I said, it's that extra step of recognizing it through a like, a repost, or some type of recognition that makes it impermissible. So I guess to sum up those points, the post not only records the student athlete's participation, but suggests the student athlete's work in the off season is viewed favorably. And it's not too far of a leap that, you know, that could translate to the coach viewing the student athlete more favorably when it comes to playtime in season. So that goes to that final point of the definition of what makes something voluntary, there being some type of award or recognition for their participation. So as we discuss these examples, you can see much of the analysis here seems more like a field test. Does it feel like the activity is no longer voluntary because of the institution's actions? So if you ask yourself that question and you think there's even a chance the answer could be yes, you're probably right. And that's why there's not a ton of flexibility in this area. And sure, are there examples where a coach can post about a student athlete engaging in voluntary athletically related activities? Absolutely. You can see on the slide under kind of the yeses that it's okay for community service activities. And also, for example, if the student athlete's team places first in their summer baseball league. So there is a legislative exception that allows the coach to be there for that summer baseball league and to cheer on their student athlete with the conditions that the opportunity to view that activity is open to all and the coach is not supervising or conducting the activity. So those specific conditions are what protect the interest of the student athlete. So posting a picture of those activities would not compromise Bylaw 17 concerns in the same way that posting a voluntary workout would. And I believe this question was asked earlier in the presentation, and that's, how does this apply to strength and conditioning coach? We know that coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, can conduct workouts out of season during the academic year. What if they post about them? So those posts are subject to the legislation as well. If the certified strength and conditioning coach posts a picture or a video of a student athlete engaging in voluntary workouts out of season, we're back to those original concerns about negating the voluntary nature of the workouts. And that applies whether or not the strength coach is the sport-specific coach for the team they're posting about. The strength coach is an institutional athletic staff member, so recording or posting about those voluntary workouts on the coach's account or the institutional account serves as reporting back to the sport-specific coach. And we've already discussed that the coach posting these activities about their own team is not okay. It goes above and beyond permissibly collecting data as part of your strength and conditioning coach responsibilities.
Hey, Caitlin, so you have answered with this chart a bunch of the things that have come in, but I'm just gonna toss maybe a clarifying question at you. Do strength and conditioning coaches fall under coach for purposes of these charts?
Yes, yes, so they would. So whether your certified strength and conditioning coach is the sport-specific coach, so say that, you know, your basketball coach is also your certified strength and conditioning coach, and they post a video or a picture of their basketball team engaging in these voluntary workouts, that would not be permissible. And that applies whether it gets posted to the coach's personal account or the institutional account. And the thought is that it really does negate the voluntary nature of the workout, and it goes above and beyond just collecting data. I mean, as a strength coach, yeah, sure, they're able to collect the data for what they're doing during their workouts, but we're talking about that extra step of, are you comparing and contrasting the data and your student athletes? Are you posting about it and recognizing their efforts in that activity? It's that extra step that makes it impermissible. So the strength coach is subject to this legislation as well. And like I said, even if you're not the sport-specific coach for what you're posting about, you posting it on your, you coach your institutional athletics account or your personal account as an institutional staff member, that post in and of itself is reporting it back to the sport-specific coach.
Awesome, thank you. I think this one's probably better suited for Tiffany. Is there a limit to the number of strength and conditioning coaches that can be on a department staff? Like, could every team have a certified strength and conditioning coach?
Yeah, so there's no limit to the number. I mean, it's up to every department and what they can afford, particularly if they're the ones paying for the certification, obviously. But even if every sport, per se, had a strength and conditioning coach, you know, one of their coaches become certified, you have to keep in mind that for voluntary workouts, a strength and conditioning coach who's certified, who's also a coach, a team coach, has to do workouts with folks beyond just their team. So if you have a softball coach and a track coach and everybody who's become certified, they still can't just limit their out-of-season trainings or those strength and conditioning workouts to members of their own team just because they're certified.
And we've had this one come in a couple of different ways. Caitlin, I think this would fall more into your realm. Can you talk a little bit about a Instagram, for example, takeover, where a student athlete might post at different times during the day what they're doing outside of the season? Is that permissible?
Not under existing legislation, no, because they would be posting to an institutional account.
One more for you, Caitlin. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So is there a difference between the timing of when a video or a photo is taken and when it's posted? So for example, could you post video from in season, out of season as like a TBT or something like that?
I believe we received that question through our SRO, and I don't know off the top of my head. I can double check on that, but I'd have to double check on that. I don't know off the top of my head. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of the week.